All right, fellas, welcome to the Front Row Dads podcast. My guest today, Jon D'Agostini, is here. He has been married for 7 years, has 2 kids, 5 and 3. He is the founder of Invictus Leadership, a mentoring program for young men, and has mentored individuals from quite a diverse set of backgrounds here, from at-risk students to juvenile offenders to athletes and Olympians. In talking with him and preparing for this show, clearly fitness and strength and masculinity is the core of our conversation today, which is rooted in some pretty compelling stories, and I'll get to that in just a moment. He put a lot of these stories into a book called Aimless, A Journey to Constructive Masculinity. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Jon is that I was interviewed on a show not too long ago, and somebody asked me for my definition of masculinity, and the truth is I didn't have one. And I'm like, well, I'm trying to figure that out. Ultimately, I've got a lot of questions around that. So this will be an interesting conversation. The book's doing well. Silver medalist at the Illumination Book Awards, gold medalist at the Independent Published Book Awards. Currently speaking on the topic of reframing masculinity, and that will be kind of at the core of our conversation. But of course, we'll travel into his past, some compelling stories that led to a lot of this work, along with how he's showing up for his family these days. If you want to learn more, it's JonDagsMentors.com. That's Jon, JOHNDAGS, mentors.com. We'll link to all these in the show notes over at frontrowdads.com. And it's going to be a great show. Jon, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So when I was thinking about this interview, which I usually think about, where do I launch in? Like, what's the starting point? And there's like a philosophy of like, let's ease into it with like, hey man, how's your day? And I was like, I think for this one, we're going to take a head first dive into the deep end. And I want to read the opening of your book, which is titled The Worst Day of My Life, 2013. And I'm going to read this. I want to prepare everybody because, it's this is a little bit of a tougher subject. I'm just going to leave it at that without building this up too much. But Jon, thank you in advance for being willing to talk about these things, to bring these things back up, and then to talk about how they're influencing your life now. All right, so here's what it says. You write, years earlier, my mother unlocked the door and snuck into my room while I was sleeping. It was a rough experience. After that, I took precautions. Every night I barricaded the door and hid a knife behind my nightstand. This night, she woke me up by slamming herself against the door. I heard the lock open and saw the handle turn. I got out of bed and grabbed the knife. She usually tired out, but tonight she escalated. She began violently beating the door and screaming threats. She finally quit at 3 a.m., but the smell of her rotten booze breath remained. I stood there with a knife in my hand until the sun came up. I was completely numb. Why was it not turning? Oh, is that right? Hold on. Did I go too far? I'm having problems here. There we go. She always slept late, so eventually I knew it was safe to come out. I went through the house and made sure she didn't leave any stove burners lit or the oven on and open. Luckily, she only opened all the drawers and cabinets in the house. She did some stuff like this all the time. It used to scare me, but over time it became annoying. I always had to clean up after her. I walked to her bedroom and pressed my ear to the door, but didn't hear anything. I entered and saw that her bed was empty, so I checked the bathroom. There she was, slumped against the wall and passed out on the toilet. Her mouth open, but she didn't look like she was breathing. I checked for a pulse and found it, which I had mixed feelings about. The first few times I discovered her like this, I carried her to bed and was always concerned that she might not wake up. This time, I left her there and made myself breakfast. Hours later, she came into the kitchen, smiled, and said hello. She asked me what plans I had for the day and if I was having any luck getting job interviews. This had been our routine for years. Let me pause there and ask for you to sort of pick up and take us into this part of your life and talk to us a little bit about, what was going on here? How long had this been going on for? And what type of impact did this have on you? And I think that will create some context for why the book was written and why you're doing the work you're doing today.
So that routine had been going on with that level of intensity for a little over 2 years. Prior to those 2 years, it was a 5-year skid where she had developed a drinking problem and became an alcoholic. Her alcoholism then became so extreme and so violent because when she was walking around our neighborhood, a couple of people were in from out of town. They had 2 big 100-pound dogs that chased after our dog and accidentally knocked my mother to the ground, and she broke her back and was prescribed pain medication, was the big hitters, Vicodin and all that stuff. She then took a Vicodin with wine, and I remember being there in that moment, advising her not to do that. She had a background in medicine. She was a nurse practitioner, and she said, "No, I'll be fine." And that kicked off a just horrible decline of addiction. And
how old were you at that age?
That began when I was 20. Okay. So she had started drinking at 18, 19 for about 2 years. And then for 3 years, she did both and became completely unhinged. And then those last 2 years, it was really intense. If she was home and I was home, things just got really out of control. So that chapter entitled "The Worst Day of My Life" really became the gateway through which I basically died internally and became a different person, a person I didn't know, and a person that was quite reckless, frankly. So that then kicked off a very long, spirited, and incredibly painful growth process of introspection and contemplation and reflection and prayer. I didn't have a faith at the time, and I knew I needed to find one because I certainly wasn't strong enough to handle these things on my own. And it also was incredibly isolating because I couldn't speak to anybody about these things. My mother was my hero. She was a wonderful person, and we had roughly 20 fantastic years together, and that's what everybody knew about her. So friends and family, I lost a lot of relationships, was ostracized in many ways, and just had to stick to my guns. And you say something like that, but at the time I didn't even know what principles I believed in. I mean, I had lost my family. I lost a large part of my identity. Wasn't a son. I wasn't a brother. My sister had also developed a horrible addiction coinciding with my mother. So our family just blew up, and I'm a family man. And so I entered into the world as right as I graduated college, just completely lost with very little support. And the book goes on to detail me making the hard decision to reach out for help. And I didn't tell them why. I just told them I need a place to stay. And it was a good buddy of mine. His name's Mike, and his parents took me in for that summer. And I met a few really interesting people that took me under their wing. And make a long story short, I decided to write my own curriculum for a young men's leadership development program centered on mentorship. And it was so wildly successful through referrals only that I had to basically shut down applications and work with a group of 60 young men. And they all did so well, John, that I mean, it's hard to imagine. Looking back, when I think about it, and I'm communicating with them all the time, I'm talking with them regularly, I just look back, and one of a set of parents just sent me a picture this morning of when I first started working with their son 6-7 years ago. And I'm going, oh my gosh, how did this happen? I mean, we had 100% were elected into leadership positions or assumed leadership positions. We had a professional athlete in every major sports organization. We had special forces. We had musicians, chemists, scholars, regular Joes, first in their family to graduate college or even go to college. I've worked with immigrants, second language speakers. It's just been an incredible journey that I know for a fact would have happened if I hadn't lost my family. So it's ironic.
How are things today with your family, with those that might have turned their back on you at some point?
Well, I think it's peaceful and cordial with those. I think that over the years they saw as they kind of got a little bit more involved, they saw the path of destruction, and at minimum realized this isn't so cut and dry. It's not black and white. It's really complicated, and really awful. And I'm certainly not without blame. I participated and contributed negatively, no question. But unfortunately, my sister just passed away a couple weeks ago, and my mother is in very poor health. But I don't think there are any hard feelings. Certainly not any contempt or resentment. I think right now there's just an agreement to continue to love each other, but from a distance. And there's very little opportunity to regain what we once had. Certainly not with the presence of ongoing chemical use. So it's very challenging. It's something I deal with every day. It's something I think about every day, but it's also a source of inspiration, and oddly has become an anchor for me as a husband and father to ensure that the family dynamic is such that we don't carry pain in silence. We share our pain, we share our celebrations with each other, and to know that no matter what happens, we can vocalize our distress. And certainly with my kids, Dad, can I tell you something? I always say, you can tell me anything at any time, just to keep the door wide open. And that's kind of where it's at today.
Mm. Do you feel that you've forgiven your mom? Has she forgiven you?
Oh, of course I've forgiven my mom. I forgave my sister as well. I mean, I knew right away that this was not a tally sheet or a bar tab that I really wanted to log or keep track of. It was so messy and slimy and terrible. And I have never held anything against either of them. I've had big emotions, anger and rage and grief. But I've never held anything against either one of them, ever. It's never entered my mind. And I think a lot of times when I speak to people and they get a little uncomfortable hearing the story, the first thing they say is, you got to forgive and forget. I said, well, I already forgave them. It was immediate. But I don't think I want to forget this, because it's become a source of personal growth. And it's a perspective that I, quite honestly, Jon, never want to lose. We're all just one text away from having our life turned completely and utterly upside down. And any sense of control you have is an illusion. And in some points, it's a delusion. We need to have support systems and relationships and be relationship forward in our life, and to do away with this nonsensical, destructive Lone Ranger mentality that's drilled into our brain from day one, which is total baloney. So yeah, there's always a sense of forgiveness. And as I've crafted out a faith and built up a faith structure, forgiveness is paramount. And believe it or not, I go into schools and these colleges to talk about masculinity. And the number one topic that there are several big topics, and they're kind of all tied, but one of them is forgiveness and grace, where young adults today want to know why we should practice forgiveness when people hurt us. And it's just a big, booming, very sensitive conversation, because I think a lot of people have misunderstood the nature of forgiveness, which is not to say I forgive you, which means what you did to me is okay. That's not forgiveness. It's not okay to hurt each other. Forgiveness is to relieve you of my perceived debt that you owe me. And that to me is to relieve that sense of debt, or to relieve yourself of the feeling that I'm going through life feeling like I'm owed something, which puts you in a taking position instead of a giving position. And it's just not a very functional strategy if you're just going through life constantly asking, what am I going to get from this person or this situation?
Mm. A couple things that you wrote that I had highlighted in your book, and going back to, how you reacted early. Right, going back to the core of the story, you wrote, like many men, I abided by toxic masculine themes, violence, emotional suppression, and intolerance of women, just to name a few, to the point to where they ruined my life. Can you talk a little bit more about what you did do, what you used to do, how you formerly handled all this, Because then I want to get into the natural evolution of like your point about asking for help, and then what healing and help actually looks like. What is a good mentor? So let's start with when wasn't it going well? What does that look like specifically?
Well, I think it looks different on everybody, but the common themes within the male community, first is self-isolation, where that's a tried and true strategy for personal growth. If you're going to self-isolate to contemplate, reflect, and pray, so an internal journey to then express outwardly. But that's not what we do. We self-isolate to protect our egos and to suppress emotion. And that means you're cutting yourself off from the tides of life. You're cutting yourself off from the energies of others. And we turn pretty sour. I mean, if you look at the men who are doing really awful, violent things across the board, they all are isolated. They lack genuine friendships and brotherhoods, and have been outcast. So, if left to isolation, knowing that we are built to connect and we require connection for our health, wellness, and vitality, when we disconnect, we turn sour and downright violent. So for me, I would self-isolate and I would drink a great deal of alcohol, not because I enjoyed the feeling of being drunk. I actually hated that feeling. I was a weird drinker. I would drink to help me sleep, because at night, when the lights were off and my head was on the pillow, or in many cases, I was couch surfing for many years or on people's floors, the lights would go off and the demons would come in, and it was unbearable. And it was terrifying, and the nightmares and the night terrors, and the full body, almost electrocution type symptoms. And then if I was able to fall asleep in the mornings, I would be paralyzed, and I would be just too much cowardice to even get out of bed and address the day. So self-isolation and a great deal of alcohol abuse. And then I started to develop a very complicated relationship with women, where I would not allow them in. I would not, if I felt that I was connecting with somebody at too deep a level, I would sever it or just hinder it or barrier it, and make sure I didn't get too close to protect myself from pain, disappointment, adversity, ambiguity, etc. So I started to live a very private life of self-destruction, and then interpersonally and socially a very surface level life, while also acknowledging, in maybe not the best words internally, but between my ears, knowing that this isn't working. This isn't enough. And so that then led to, well, if it's not enough, maybe I just need more. So I would party more, drink more, work more. I was always working at least 3 jobs. And I was very sexually promiscuous during those years. And it became a source of stimulus. So with that, then I also then lost all respect for the sanctity of marriage. I lost all interest in monogamy. I hadn't quit on love. I had always believed in love, but maybe love was something that would be arranged and controlled and not so threatening. And I pursued that with more arranged type relationships with women, and where there wasn't a great deal of passion or love, but there was some sort of friendship or respect. And that kind of is how it evolved. But then what ended up happening was, while I was staying at my buddy Mike's parents' place, luckily, and I truly, through the grace of God, my dad and I had somehow maintained a wonderful relationship, and we had connected on a much deeper level.
Were your parents married during all this?
They were in the process of getting divorced, but initially they were married. Yep.
He wasn't in the home when all these violent encounters were happening.
When he left, that's when everything got really, really out of control, because my brother-in-law had gone overseas. He was in the army and he was serving tours in Afghanistan. And my sister was left with her children with a full-on drug addiction. So my sister would come into my mother's home, or my home where I grew up. And I was ending up taking care of her young children because she was so wasted. She wouldn't get out of bed, and I had to give her CPR a bunch of times in front of her kids. It was just horrible. It was just a horrible, horrible scene. And so my dad and I had remained close. And to this day, we have a wonderful relationship. And we would go into Valley Forge Park and we would just hike for miles. I mean, I think we averaged anywhere between 40 to 50 miles a week, and we would just hoof it out and talk about things in our own way. And that kept me afloat, and it kept me grounded. At least I had one safe relationship, and it happened to be my dad, which is truly a blessing. And so I was speaking with my dad, and my dad reached out, had met a man named Gene Miller. And Gene is a former professor of leadership and ethics at the Naval Academy and a Top Gun pilot, and now flies commercially. And he's just a wonderful, wonderful man. And he was talking with Gene. My dad was talking with Gene, and I'm not sure what he said, but only recently I kind of wondered, what degree of vulnerability, or what did my dad share with Gene about his son, who on paper looks like he's doing really well, but internally I was beyond struggling. I was broken. So Gene told my dad, said, "Hey, have him meet me at this office of a mutual friend of theirs." And I was landscaping at the time, so I got a text from my dad, "Meet this guy." I said, "Well, Dad, I mean, I'm covered in dirt. I got a beard with a cut-off shirt, boots, and I mean, I'm a mess. He wants me to meet him right now. I don't have time to shower or do any of that stuff." And he goes, "No, it's not a interview. Just go meet him." Mm. And so I met Gene, and we chatted, and he was one of the easiest people to talk to, which I found interesting at that time, because he was such a high level achiever, and I hadn't met that level of approachability for somebody who was so buttoned up and with that level of prestige and accolades to him. So it was really different for me, and kind of almost like a microclimate. And he goes, "Look, I'm going to offer you an unpaid internship. I'm going to work you like a dog, and you're going to be here for extended hours. You're going to be the first one here, last one to leave, and you're not going to make any money." And I wanted to work for him immediately. I mean, my answer was immediately yes. But he goes, "Take 2 weeks to think about it, because you're going to work. You're really going to work." And I said, "Okay, sure. Well, I'm not afraid to work, but I'll honor your suggestion for 2 weeks." And I couldn't get a job at that time. And the morning I was scheduled to call Gene, I got 3 emails from all of these applications and interviews that I had been doing that summer, and I had had no luck. And somehow I had been offered 3 jobs that morning. The morning I was supposed to tell Gene I was going to take an unpaid internship, I was offered 3 career paths, one of which I was extremely interested in, and got really lucky. And I had interviewed exceptionally well because I speak Italian, and there was an Italian influence to that particular profession. And so I was sitting there, and I'm going, "Oh my gosh, I cannot believe I'm going to say no to this man. He extended me tremendous kindness, compassion, and personal time and grace, and all of these things." And I'm on the phone with him, and I told him what I was going to do, and he wished me the absolute best of luck. And I said, "Gene, I want to come work for you." And so it's just a totally reckless and incredibly stupid decision by all accounts. But certainly ended up being the best thing I ever did. He introduced me to service. He taught me how to write curriculum. I ended up writing curriculum that was scaled to over 10,000 students in 10 major American cities. I was able to work in the executive suite advising, and also on the street level working with young people. So despite making very little money, it was the best thing I ever did. And that's where I learned the skills to do Invictus.
So cool. I want to echo something that you said earlier, and I'm reading directly from the book. It says, instead, constructive masculinity promotes men to build strength through connection. And this is in response to in place of being isolated. And I really think that's right. That's what we're talking about here. And this is really what Front Row Dads was all about. I mean, the whole reason, you may or may not know this, that I started this community was I just felt like I was failing as a dad. I wasn't getting anything right. I was, and I needed a place that I could have that connection, which led to great conversation, but some real conversation. You also wrote, the most consistent driver of personal growth is the internal acceptance of external energies. What do you mean by that?
We are built to connect, and in order to do so, we have to be open and vulnerable. And I wholeheartedly believe, I mean, if you use, something as simple as naturalistic learning, in order for a tree to grow, it's got to be good soil, good seed, water, wind, and a little bit of care and a little bit of luck. And I think it's the same for men. I think it's the same for everybody, but most especially men, because of the false ideologies that get pumped into us on a steady IV drip from day one. So being open and allowing people to get to know you is truly important. And then that branches off into, well, if I'm going to allow somebody to get to know me, I also need to allow somebody to care for me, which is very difficult because
Why?
because I think we know we're flawed, and we know we're going to let them down at some point. We're going to hurt them. And so better to keep it in a controlled space where we can kind of just kibitz and goof around. And there's certainly a lot of value in that, no question. We don't always have to be so deep into these conversations. We can connect and heal and grow just by getting together and shooting hoops or doing whatever. It doesn't have to be so serious and so deep. But allowing somebody to care for you is a terrifying thing, and especially initially. But once you learn the value of it and you digest it, and you realize how much stronger you become as a result of it, and also how grateful you feel to have people in your life that care about you, you're thereby far more likely to extend that grace to other people, and especially that messaging to young men. And the young guys that I worked with, the juvenile offenders, the guys who have done some heinous things and made some really awful decisions, actions, and choices. This is a main theme in those conversations: is you don't have to listen to me, but it would behoove you to at least consider allowing a couple men in your life to care for you, because believe it or not, although it's likely that a great deal of men have harmed you, there are also far more men out there that would be happy, thrilled to lend you a helping hand, to offer you a kind word, or something as simple as a silent hug or affirmation of how difficult the road of life can be. And once those guys have that, they're the easiest to work with by far. Because they're just so motivated, and their pain point, their perspective is always there of, this is how silly and out of control life can get. And helping them identify how they got there then allows them basically to navigate away from those potholes and cement, or at least develop more constructive behaviors and belief systems to foster their own growth. But it is absolutely centered on being open to the world and other people.
When men have the right environment, right, and they stop isolating and start connecting,
yep.
What do they want to talk about? What are some of the trends that you see? What are the topics? What are the questions? What are the, what do you see happening in these conversations that's creating positive transformation?
Well, I think there are two different groups. And they have such gravity that they're little fractured things in between. But I think there are two groups. Are you married and do you have kids, or are you unmarried and do you not have kids? It's kind of one of those deals. So the non-married and no kids, these guys want to talk about self-study and faith exploration. Who am I and what do I believe in? How do they influence each other? How to cultivate meaningful relationships and brotherhoods, as well as how to get out of toxic relationships. Because of the way that they communicate, 87% of their communication is done digitally. And when you have that heft of communication done digitally, it's real easy to misconstrue, misunderstand, and develop toxic relationships, because there's no accountability digitally.
And you're talking men or women, with their buddies or their people they're dating?
Definitely both. But the non-married, no kids are really curious about how to
have an intimate relationship,
but also what is intimacy? Is it different than sex?
Yeah.
And that's been really remarkable, actually. Their candor and hunger for these conversations is remarkable. And then the third thing there would be sex. And it's not the mechanics of it, what do I do with A and B to get C? It's, why am I so discontent? Like, why I thought sex was supposed to be this great thing. Why am I not experiencing that? And then kind of the even deeper, more quieter, where they're hush, hush, behind closed doors is, hey, I can't respond. Like my body doesn't respond and I don't know why. And so I checked into that. And I have an ideology and a curriculum for that, as well as you have to attack it through physiological diet and lifestyle and all those things. But there are all some societal habits that are contributing to that. Excessive pornography, transactional hedonism, objectification. These are all things that they practice and they don't even realize it, to the point where the fastest growing population of men with erectile dysfunction are men in their 20s and 30s, which is terrifying, because being able to achieve and maintain an erection is a very tried and true indicator of heart health.
Yeah.
If you're not doing that, it's likely or possible that your ticker is not going to be too good by the time you're in your 40s. And that's going to be a massive issue.
What's the main cause of this? Why is this happening?
Well, their diet is crap. It's just total garbage. Their lifestyles are hollow,
These are the basics, right? They're not sleeping enough. They're not eating right.
Not sleeping enough, not eating
exercising,
right, not exercising,
stressed.
not engaging in in-person, interpersonal experiences. They look at a lot of pornography, and they're on their phone for an average of 8 hours a day. That's 56 hours a week. So they have essentially an investment banker full-time job as a digital consumer. And their thumb travels the distance of 2 Statues of Liberty every day.
Whoa.
So
dude, that's crazy. I've never heard that.
No, it's wild. And so one of my main things is actually teaching them how to use their smartphones. Because
what do you mean? What do you mean?
Well, you have to use your smartphone to run down passions, interests, and execute your responsibilities. And if you're going to communicate with your peers and pals, do so in a way that you can actually then meet in person and have real experiences in your life, and not these digital fantasies, which actually are contributing to your sense of malaise and anxiety and depression. So I actually advise guys to use their phones, but to use it in a way that builds them up.
Yeah, it's smart.
Builds up their life. Telling them not to use your phones is like telling the smokers back in the 80s and 90s not to smoke, where they're going to laugh you out of the room and spit at your feet. Yes. So it's just not a viable strategy to tell them not to use their phones.
Sure.
So there's that. And then there's also what pornography does to the brain. And I'm not assigning morality to pornography. I don't even go down that road. What it does to your brain is it rewires your brain to respond to the artificial, to the curated, to the entertainment aspect of sex, not the natural, not the genuine, not the spiritual side of sex. You're rewiring your brain and removing your God-given ability to respond naturally in these situations. And then you're watching a style of sex that is penetration based, and there's a great deal of male dominance, and it can be quite violent. And the algorithms that porn uses are not to send you to more mundane expressions of sexuality, but to more extreme expressions of sexuality. So therefore you're training yourself to respond to more and more extreme things. And then when you're in a natural situation, you don't respond. And what men generally do, because we're ego-based creatures, unless we're coached out of it or mentored out of it, is we then blame the woman for straight men. So the woman doesn't have these types of breasts or this type of body. She's not willing to do this. Not my problem. So it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And then also it teaches men to believe that orgasm for women can be achieved through penetration. While that is true, it's less than 30% of women who can climax penetration. There's usually a combination or clitoral or something like that, and the other 70%. So you're learning all of the wrong things and then blaming the woman, or you're shaming the heck out of yourself because you're not sure what's going on. And if you don't have an outlet to discuss these things, it's extremely unlikely that you're going to come across some sort of digital source of information that can help coach you out of it.
Do you think there's I'm so happy with the direction of our conversation. We're touching on some really interesting subject matters here that I think affect a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely.
For the men and their kids. I think men are equally struggling with what you're saying as their young sons, right? Clearly.
Yeah.
But do you think there's a case for, healthy pornography, ethical pornography, And without having to like create too much context for that question, like if a consenting couple wants to open up their computer and be like, let's watch some porn together, is that okay? Is it okay if the wife is on the road and she's like, hey, well, I'm gone, if you want to, you know, you want to download a little porn to take care of yourself, keeps you from cheating on me? I mean, you know, again, I'm projecting a lot of like,
sure,
both funny, but maybe serious, and likely both stereotypes of like all the things that can happen. So talk to me about your opinion there.
So, well, then this leads naturally into the other group that I was talking about, which are fathers and husbands. And so the question there is always a question of intimacy and passion. And I do believe that there are ways that are more functional and sustainable to stimulate your brain, get in the mood, deactivate the stress side of your brain, and activate the more creative and spiritual side of your brain. And it's called art. We're losing our artistic community rapidly. Schools are selling off their art to try and offset the lack of tuition payments because not as many people are going to college. And art itself is not being seen as a worthwhile pursuit. And I advise all the guys I work with, regardless of what bucket they're in or age they're in, to practice some sort of reflection and self-expression. So if you're going to journal. If you're going to do martial arts, do martial arts. If you're going to do art, learn how to do art. If you want to write poetry, but learn how to express yourself so that you're engaging the more creative, connection-based side of your brain. And then in terms of telling couples what to do about, if somebody goes away, or is there a moral case, not a moral case, but a functional case for pornography in their marriage? I'm not the one to determine that. I think that needs to be decided in-house on an individualized basis. And also to understand that there's a difference between intimacy and passion. There's a difference between, although there can be an overlap, there's a difference between eros, meaning the things that turn us on, and then what is actually healthy for us. So when I was single, I was quite promiscuous, which was a form of eros. It was a form of eroticism for me, but it was horribly destructive and did nothing good for me. I mean, the first 2 months, yeah, this is great. But then after that, the sense of hollowness and emptiness and depression came in like a tidal wave. And I had to make a decision, well, I don't necessarily believe in the value of monogamy, but polygamy and being promiscuous, this isn't working for me. I mean, this is making me miserable. So maybe I need to learn a little bit more. And that's what I advise men to do, is to engage entirely, because I believe wholeheartedly that most men, if not the vast majority of men, want to be good husbands and good lovers for their wives. So if you want to do that, you need to learn about yourself, meaning what's your eros, what are you into, what stimulates you, and how can you share that with your partner? And then in straight cases, you have to learn about your woman as well. I mean, you have to learn about what is going on in her head, and also understand that women are generally operating under a fundamentally different existence than men are. We don't live under the threat of violence like women do. That is a fact. I mean, the vast majority of rapes are committed by men, and the vast majority of those victims are women. Just that alone is enough to put women on edge. And in order for women to experience the highest level of pleasure, you have to provide a great deal of safety. And that then can be coupled with other things like a hint of danger or whatever, but they need to know that they are indeed safe with their husband. And that is a way to deactivate the one portion of the brain that is more stress-oriented or achievement-oriented, and then deactivate and then activate the other side, which is more connection, creative, and sensuality-based. And there's plenty of books on this. I'd be happy to share them with you. They're wildly interesting, largely written by women. But it's to the point now where I don't advise people to have sex. I actually say the total opposite. I always advise chastity, because the vast majority of your relationship is going to be spent not having sex. It's going to be spent.
Yeah, good point.
Okay,
spent
being a friend, and basically a teammate, right? A confidant. So in order to help deactivate that portion of your partner's brain or woman's brain, you better get good at those roles. Be a good friend, be a good confidant, be trustworthy, be dependable. No, you don't have to be Superman, but work on that virtue of chastity. That doesn't mean that you disregard your sexual urges. It's quite the opposite. It's a way of honoring them to a point where you can share them together. And that then becomes a significantly more meaningful and pleasurable experience because you're both fully present in the moment, and expressing your sexuality through your love and passion and eros for one another. And I feel that that's certainly the most functional way to do that. And if pornography plays a role in that, fine. I have a love-hate relationship with porn. I check it maybe 2 or 3 times a year at this point, where it used to be 5 times a day. And every time I go in, I'm like, God, this just reminds me of a former life that I'm trying to get away from, and it just doesn't do it for me anymore. But I understand why people use it. So that's kind of my long-winded way of saying, focusing on connection and friendship and that sort of dependability to deactivate that achiever mindset and then activate the more sensual, creative, and sexual aspect of the woman's brain.
How you doing on time, Jon?
I'm fine.
Okay. Let me ask you two topics I want to cover before we wrap. The one is masculinity from the definition of what that is for you. And then ultimately asking the question, what do we do to cultivate constructive, healthy, thriving masculinity? So first, let's define it, and then let's talk about what we need to do to create that.
Okay. Well, in terms of a definition, I'll start with my definition of masculinity is one based on humanitarian and spiritual principles, wherein a man can then freely express his masculinity on his own terms. So provided that there's a framework on being relationship forward, putting people first, and having some sort of faith system, some sort of knowledge that you're not the center of the universe and it's not about you. Okay. That then you can express freely. I mean, I wrote Aimless as a way to honor every individual's God-given right to express their gender on their own terms. And so that's for me. The second thing is then we have to also be real and a bit pragmatic in terms of the growth of society, because if we're not going to focus solely on ourselves, which is what I'm talking about in terms of humanitarian and spiritual principles, to just know that.
Hold on, Jon, let me pause you real quick. I just want to dig into this for a quick second and ask, when you talk about masculinity, do you get a lot of, does the topic of genders pop up for you a lot right now? Where do people want to pull you into this conversation of like, is there just male and female, or, are there 2 genders, like that type of conversation? And I'm not necessarily asking for you to unpack all that. I'm more out of curiosity asking, is that something you get pulled into a lot? And if so, how do you respond to that?
I do. I get pulled in all the time. And in fact, when I wrote Aimless, I went out of my way to partner exclusively with women and members of the LGBTQ plus to bring it to market. I know how I look and I know how I sound, and I know the way I talk could easily be misconstrued for nefarious purposes. So I partnered with people who thought differently than me, but were impassioned by this idea of we need to lift men up, because I haven't met a single person who does not acknowledge that men are trending very poorly and have been for quite a while. Now, what their next step to that, or the next opinion, whether we should lift them up or how we're going to do that, well, then it's totally fractured and everything's different. But across the board, everybody acknowledges that men aren't doing so hot, and there are life expectancy, health, everything is going into the crapper. Okay. So there's that. And then 2, in terms of asking me about genders, I'll only repeat what I have read. Okay. And I've read from everything from left to right, red to blue, Christian to non-Christian. I've read tons of materials from the trans community. What I can say at this point right now is biologically there are 2. That's it. Now there are an unlimited amount of expressions of those 2. And that then you start swimming into a lack of continuity in terms of belief systems from all of these pockets. And so right now, that's the only place where I can comment, because once you get beyond that, it gets into opinion. And there are some really strong opinions out there. And it's so fresh and early in this game. The scholarship is most certainly not set. And anybody who says the science is set is full of baloney, because it is not. The science very clearly X, X, Y, and then you have these little derivatives mostly, but it's mostly X, 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 Y. So it's a really hot topic. And what I will say is when I was going through and researching for Aimless, and I read a lot of materials from the trans community and trans scholars, the number one takeaway I had, at least, and this is my personal takeaway, is these people suffer, and it's uncomfortable to read, and it stirred up a great deal of compassion within me, and it's staggering, the internal distress that these people feel, and it's not something that I can experience from their position, but I do understand personal distress, and I do understand internal suffering.
Right.
And I know what that did to me. And in that way, it allows me to be a wholehearted good Samaritan, in a way where if somebody's down on the street bleeding, I'm not going to go up to them and say, hey, did you vote red or blue? Could you tell me your pronouns, please? I'm just going to go up and say, hey, can I help you?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Period. And that's where I'm at with it, John.
In studying all of masculinity, it likely leads you down the road of studying femininity, and which is always a tough word for me to say.
Yeah, it is. It's a hard word. Yeah.
And everything, like you said, in between, and try to, which I appreciate. I value curiosity. I'm really not in by brand one to come out and say, I've got it all figured out, and here's exactly what it is. But I really I vibe with being more curious about definitions, and how do you define that, and how do I define that, and how ultimately can we just get along in a society? That's what I'm most concerned with. But did you happen to stumble upon that movie, What is a Woman?
No.
Oh man, that's a fascinating side to the story too. I just wanted to toss that out there. It was fresh in my mind. I just had seen something about it recently, but and it's not to anchor a point of like everything in that movie is true, everything in that movie is false. I rarely try to say things to that level of extreme, but I think when we study masculinity or what it means to be a man, I think it's also healthy to ask what it means to be a woman, and it helps us to see the polarity that potentially exists there. Let me ask a different way about masculinity. Do you have a singular definition that you've buttoned up in as few words as possible what masculinity is?
Oh, definitely not. No, okay. I don't. And I do that purposefully, because if I do that, then I would then be falling into the very trap I was trying to get out of, which is, I'm not into this idea of establishing a set criterion of what it means to be a man, a checklist. That, what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman, we should also then ask, what does it mean to be a person? And what does that mean? And what are the concentric circles here? Because as different as we are fundamentally, we do need to know the ways in which we are similar. So no, I don't have a buttoned up. If I ever did, I would have to wordsmith it so carefully to allow for those expressions, and the fluidity, and I'm a different person every day. I try and abide by the same principles, but I am a different person every day, because every day is different. So yeah, that's why.
All right. The last subject, and it's hard to move away from these, because again, there's hours of discussion to be had in any one of these given areas. But I want to talk briefly before we go about mentorship, because as that being a core pillar of what you're doing, how do you currently look at mentoring others or being mentored? Are there some frameworks within that? Are there things that men can take away from this conversation? And if they're a mentor to a young man or woman in their life, or if they're being mentored by somebody, give us something to chew on or think about in regards to that space, perhaps through your own stories, anecdotes, etc.
Sure. So we are now in the midst of doing train the trainer type workshops and curriculums, so that we can scale mentorship. And mentorship to me is a lateral relationship. So it's not vertical, it's not horizontal, it's shoulder to shoulder. And I'm not behind you cracking the whip motivating you. I'm not in front of you pulling you along. Okay. It is a freedom to walk your own road, and a respect of that road, whatever it may be. So to me, what I do is something called structured mentoring, where it's not just relationship forward, but it's relationship paired with curriculum. And the curriculum is growth focused. And so as you go along and you're making mistakes, when you're falling down, you're falling forward. So it's totally growth focused. And that doesn't mean that you're being perfect. It's actually the opposite. It's accepting your imperfections as well as the responsibility to improve upon them. And you do so with somebody else. That is going to give you a non-judgmental, safe space to bounce those ideas, pain points, distresses, adversities, ambiguities, and successes with another human being that you trust, that you know is imperfect as well. And you're journeying through, there's a stretch of your road that you're going along with somebody else. And then, you kind of go back and forth and the roads diverge and then you meet up again down the road. But in my mind, the end goal of a mentorship is always collaboration. And it's always this sense of stewardship where Gene did it for me, Brendan did it for me, Jeannie did it for me. Okay. They took me under their wing and I'm so grateful for them doing that I then try to pass it on to somebody else. So it's a stewardship, it's a servant leadership. And it used to be a mainstay in functional society, but it got washed out. And somewhere along the lines, the idea of being a man meant going it alone. And so the idea of mentorship was no longer attractive. But it is an antidote for what we're facing right now, because to your point with front row dads, if we really want to come out of this hole, we got to open up and connect. And mentorship is a very functional and desirable model. And if you have any listeners who are interested, I mean, that's certainly a conversation we could have, because it's really important and it's cheap. It's very cheap. It doesn't require any money. It just requires your time, effort, and care.
Jon, last question. If you get pissed these days, if you find your inner rage, if you get triggered, if you are knocked off your path somehow, for whatever reason, in any context, how do you recenter? How do you ground? How do you find your true north again and know which way to go, so that you're not violent with people, or right, that you don't fall into unhealthy patterns? How are you? Give us 3 things that you're doing at this stage of your life.
Prayer. First and foremost is prayer. Second would be sharing it with my wife, Marissa. And then third would be reminding myself what I want on my tombstone, which is loving husband and father. And that keeps my plate as clear as I can possibly keep it, by putting first things first and majoring in the majors and not majoring in the minors, as well as not, the asterisks to all 3 of those would certainly be acknowledge the things that I'm feeling and make sure I'm using the appropriate words. Am I angry? Am I frustrated? Or am I rageful? If I'm frustrated and I use the word rageful in my head, well, now I'm inflating that word, and that no longer holds as much water as it did before. So one of the biggest things we do, Jon, which is something I practice every day, is to be aware of the words between my ears and address the climate within, and to make sure that I can articulate myself where I can transfer my pain to somebody else, not expecting them to deal with it, but helping me look at it differently, helping me emote more intelligently, helping me digest and process, so that ultimately I can move past it. Because I can't stand the idea of dwelling on a momentary emotion and allowing it to ruin my week, or something like that. So you just got to eat it, digest it, and move on.
Jon, thanks for the great chat today. Fellas, if you want to learn more, I mentioned it earlier. Jon's website is jondags, D-A-G-S, mentors.com. We'll link to all that over at frontrowdads.com. And as I've done many times on the show before, and I'll do for Jon also right now, is that if you are living in the US or Canada, dig this show, want to get a copy of Aimless, Jon's book, all you need to do is just write a review somewhere on your favorite podcast channel, screenshot it, send it to info@frontrowdads.com. And the first 5 people on this episode to do that will get a copy of Jon's book mailed to them, courtesy of Front Row Dads. So the book is called Aimless, A Journey to Constructive Masculinity. Jon D'Agostini has been our guest. And Jon, thank you again for being here, for being open. I really appreciated how concise your comments were, how well thought out, the cadence and delivery of your stories. They were intriguing. They didn't ramble too long. They were just, it was great. It was really enjoyable to talk with you. And what I said to myself multiple times in this interview was, here's a guy who's done the work. That's what I kept saying. I go, oh, here's a guy who's done the work. And I really appreciate that. And I think that the world benefits from your evolution and your willingness to share it.
Well, that's an incredibly kind thing to say, and I appreciate that. And it was wonderful to speak with you as well. And I appreciate you putting a plug in for my book, which you can find on Amazon. But I think what you're doing, Jon, is unbelievable, and I'm just so grateful to be a part of it. So thank you so much for having me.
Well, perhaps there's a round two for us at some point, but for now, we'll say goodbye. All right, gentlemen, enjoy the rest of your day and take with you these ideas. Consider what it means, what masculinity means for you. Consider what mentorship means for you, both being mentored and mentoring others. And then, of course, men who are members of our community, discuss these things in your band. And if you're not in our community, discuss these things with men you trust. That's it, guys. Take care.